Good morning. Today's discussion about the art of cartography will be more theoretical in context, I suppose, than some of our other discussions have been. But nonetheless, cartography is an essential skill for any would-be navigator, and I would suggest cartography, at least at some level, is basically innate within human beings, regardless of whether we are aware or not. So developing the skill of cartography to some degree is certainly of value, and we will discuss a couple of exercises by which we can practically enhance our ability to make maps and charts. It's worth realizing that it appears that the symbolic representation of three-dimensional space is a necessary skill to many species. It has been documented that whales are capable of conversing in essence, three-dimensional representations of space through various chirps. The locational dances of bees are in essence charts, symbolic representations of space. Other examples exist. Certainly it is interesting to see in the human species the ubiquitous nature of maps and charts being made throughout history. It is especially interesting to see that even in cultures that have no written language, the arising of the use of charts of some variety is absolutely commonplace. And they take very many forms. It's important to realize that we have a modern conceptual bias about how to make maps and charts, but it's a bias. We, in the modern age, have a tendency to seek designs of charts that we view as highly scaled, topologically accurate analogs of a given space. That's not necessarily how it was always done throughout history. In fact, most early charts were more psychological constructs than they were topological analogs. What do I mean by that? Let's say that we were a navigator and we were approaching a shoreline. We have choices about how to represent that given shoreline. In the modern age, what we would attempt to do is draw a very accurate, in essence, scale model of the shoreline, choosing various details to include and various details of which to omit. But largely, we're trying to make a somewhat accurate analog to represent what it is that we see as we approach the shoreline. The ancients did not do this. Very typically, they would create a map that was largely a psychological expression of what a mariner would notice as they approached the shoreline, rather than a topological analog. What do I mean by that? Is that if I were to draw a shoreline from a more psychological point of view, rather than a point of view that was attempting to be perhaps more quote-unquote scientific, hazards on the shorelines and objects of interest would be artificially enhanced, often by size, to be shown as more prominent, as things to look for in the field, rather than them being, in essence, a scale model of what I might really see. And that's interesting. Either approach can work, but the modern approach occludes the fact that charts are always psychological representations of reality. Even if they are drawn as topological analogs, there is an inherent choice that is always made to include some material and exclude some material. The whole purpose of having a chart is to create a model which then is simplified enough that the given navigator can actually act. So while we could argue about perhaps whether purely symbolic and psychological representations of space were more or less valuable, or topological analogs were more or less valuable, the reality is that every map is a expression of both. Things are chosen by the navigator to include, and they are chosen by the navigator to omit. And those choices in themselves tell us as much about the values of the given navigator as they do the terrain and the destination and the goals of the navigator in three-dimensional space. So it is wholly possible to practice this and make this particular way of looking at maps and charts completely conscious, and it is worth our time to do so. I would suggest two practices. First of all, the first practice would be to just go for a walk, perhaps as we do with our mile walk. It wouldn't hurt if where we're going for a walk is someplace that we are somewhat unfamiliar with. And it doesn't have to be any large expedition, for sure. This is purely an experiment. But maybe for an hour, walk through an unfamiliar neighborhood and come home and create a map of the neighborhood. And one can do it in however manner one would choose. But certainly it will become immediately apparent that there is both a bias towards drawing a topological analog that comes from the modern world, as well as the interjection of a certain kind of psychological view, that there will be details that we will choose to omit that stand out to us, and there will be details that we will choose to ignore because they were not of interest to us. For example, if we were to walk around a block, something that simple, most of us are going to be able to draw a square, walk around a block, but we might notice that somebody's yard was untidy, that there were Christmas ornaments someplace perhaps, that there was an unusually obnoxious barking dog, who knows. But what we will see is that, without a doubt, there will be things that we will include and things that we will omit. And they will tell us a lot about the sort of world that we live in and the kinds of things that we have chosen to notice and not notice. It is completely possible then to attempt to do the same walk, but deliberately try to notice completely other things from a completely different point of view, and to see how that we could then also draw a map that was a topological analog, but certainly expressed completely and wholly different psychological space. The only point in this is to recognize that psychological space is inherent and it's an absolutely constant part of any kind of map making. And the navigator and the map cannot really in any kind of meaningful way be separated. All maps are going to be a representation of the choices and the values of the navigator. It's simply useful for us to make that completely overt. Now, the second experiment takes this all a step further. So let's try to think about how we would make a map of a topological space that was wholly psychological. Okay? Because this was certainly done throughout history as well. So we can imagine for ourselves, rather than a physical destination, perhaps a choice in life or a goal that we want to achieve. And in the same manner that we may draw a map of a terrain that we have walked, we can also create maps of places in our lives that we would like to go in exactly the same manner. Of course, we would list where it is that we are starting from, and we would list where it is that we are attempting to get to. And we can somehow envision a path between those 2 points in a wholly psychological space and include along that path various hazards, things that would stand in our way, various opportunities to perhaps find success on the map or on the path. My point is that you will see also throughout history navigators doing both. That there's because the ability of making maps is one of those things that exists on the fringe of external and internal space, you will see that navigators exercised both. That you can create maps for certainly navigating both kinds of experience. It's worth dabbling in. There's no right or wrong way to do that either. But I would encourage some experimentation in that, because it can become very interesting. Again, maps of internal space will demonstrate as much about the values and biases of the navigator as anything else. There will be things that you will include as hazards in your maps of your internal space that are choices, largely, that will show internal biases, things that are perhaps rightly feared, perhaps not rightly feared. And there's a great deal of information there to be learned by a little practice. So I would encourage that as well. Hopefully you will find some of this exercise useful.